Okay, so this is going to be a discussion of Black women in the civil rights movement, but it's going to be pretty general. The civil rights movement covers an incredible amount of things that happened and major ideas. This is just going to be an overview looking at some of the ways that Black women participated and led the movement. Foundations. Historians argue that Black women had a lot of experience previous to the movement that is going to contribute to their ability to work in the movement and lead in the movement and organize. And that's because they had a long process of working together to achieve community goals through church organizations and also through women's clubs. So by the time it comes to the civil rights movement, they're already used to being leaders in their own organizations. They're used to grassroots organizing to get things done. And they're used to thinking that they have to serve the community. And all of that is going to set them up for participation in the civil rights movement. There was also a number of activist women, Black women, that the movement would draw on. And I'm not going to talk about all of them because there was a lot, and you're reading about some of them. But, for example, you have Polly Murray. Polly Murray's actually a little bit questionable in that she questioned her own gender and identity a great deal and tended to think that she was actually male. So it's a little complicated whether it's she or he. But Polly Murray grows up in North Carolina, but then moves to New York City because she's unable to live with Jim Crow. She goes to college in New York City, which was a lot of work to manage, and then she applies to the all-white University of North Carolina Graduate School, which of course rejects her because she's Black. She then applies to Harvard Law School, which rejects her because she's a woman. She finally enters Howard Law School, much to the disgruntlement of many of the male students and faculty members. But she is there to become a civil rights lawyer, and she graduates at the top of her class. She's also the person who coined the term Jane Crow as a way to express the different kind of joint racism and sexism that Black women experienced. And then our second is Rosa Parks, who you probably have heard of, but Rosa Parks tends to be talked about nowadays as a hardworking woman who was tired one day and refused to get up. She's actually a lot more complicated than that. She was a dedicated activist. She joined the Alabama NAACP in 1941. She was an investigator who went into dangerous counties and went to investigate crimes that had happened, to report on them back to the NAACP. When she actually refused to get up on the bus, she has a quotation, which I'm not going to remember to say it as eloquently as she did, but basically she says, I wasn't tired like physically, I was tired of racism. And that's why she refused to get up. And she pays for her activism. She has forced to move to Detroit with her husband because they lose their jobs and they can't find any more, as well as the constant threats they get. She continued to get threats throughout the rest of her life because of her activism in Montgomery. And then finally, Ella Baker. Ella Baker's a unique woman. She began to be an activist in the 1930s, taking a job with the NAACP in 1938. She was incredibly important because she traveled through the South, building up a network of supporters for the NAACP, basically by traveling, meeting people, talking to people where they were, going to church and speaking there, and building up this network of supporters. She's sort of the ultimate background organizer, the person who gets things done at the grassroots. She's interesting, too, because she believed very firmly that power should always be in the hands of the local people, not in some central organization. And more than that, she tended to distrust powerful, charismatic leaders and felt that it was important for women, black women, and the youth, black youth, to take a prominent role in developing social activism and fighting for civil rights. And what she's famous for is she's the one who advises the young people when they come to Martin Luther King's organization. She's the one who tells them, no, don't join up with this organization. Form your own organization and let it be led by you yourselves. So very powerful women. So speaking of famous incidents that take place, we have the Montgomery bus boycott, 1955 to 1956. And the thing that you have to keep in mind when we're talking about the Montgomery bus boycott is that buses have been a big issue. Transportation had been a large issue for black travelers, but particularly black female travelers for a very long time. You have black women getting kicked off of buses and trains and streetcars starting in the 19th century all the way through to the 1950s. So it's an area, a battleground that was already well established. In Montgomery, there was a couple of issues that were going on. First of all, it was a system of racial division on the buses. So it's not a situation where there's a white area and a black area. Instead, the situation is that white people can spread out as much as they want. And as they spread out, black people are forced to squeeze themselves into a smaller and smaller area. In addition to that, the bus drivers had a reputation for sexually harassing black women who traveled on the buses. And so there was already a lot of frustration about this. And in fact, they form the Women's Political Committee, which is formed by a local college professor and some other black women. And one of their main objectives is to fix the bus system. And so they were already talking about the idea of a bus boycott well before Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. comes to town. They were already thinking about it. But when they decide they're going to do something, they're actually going to hold the boycott, all of those women who belong to the WPC, they have phone trees. And they have mimeograph machines up at the college, and they mimeograph as many flyers as they possibly can. They distribute that. They send out the news via phone trees. And that's how everybody knows to come to the first meetings where they set up the boycott. Now, the thing that develops in Montgomery is that very quickly they decide that they have to have a leader, and that leader needs to be a minister. In this case, they choose Martin Luther King Jr. And everyone accepts that that central leader has to be male. And so they create this new association, the Montgomery Improvement Association. And almost all of the leading figures in that, if you look at the people who are appointed as chairs of various committees and things like that, those are all male too. But the keeping things organized so that people have food, that people get transported, a whole bunch of that is organized by and run by black women themselves. Integrating schools. What this was the process of, after the legal challenges were made, of being the person who actually would have to go and talk to local reporters, black and white, and sometimes national reporters too, talk to the lawyers, talk to the local white school officials, and say, I want to go to this school. More than that, they had to then walk into these schools and be there day after day, despite the awful harassment from white students that they faced, as well as this ongoing tolerance by white teachers and authorities in the school of what is happening. And so it took a lot of courage. And it's actually noticeable that a lot of the people who were doing this were black girls. In the Deep South, Upper South, Midwest, all but one of the cases before Brown, and there were a number of them, that challenged segregation in public schools were filed on the behalf of black girls. After Brown, in the most contested school desegregation battles in the Deep South, girls and young women vastly outnumbered boys as the first to attend formerly all-white schools. So this was something that black girls in particular did. First of all, they faced the danger of sexual harassment, but they also were targets of violence as well. And actually, Ernest Green, one of the Little Rock Nine, remembers, the girls got it the worst. People took their femininity as a weakness and attempted to take advantage of that. And Rachel Devlin, who's written an interesting study of this, argues that part of what made it possible for black girls to do this was that they had been raised by their mothers, who often took them when they went to go to do domestic work as a way of training them how to cope with white people, basically. They also had to go shopping with their mothers and constantly deal with white sales clerks who were insulting. So basically, they had to learn how to smile, how to be polite, but also how to stand your ground. Yes, I am buying this at the same price as the white customers. Yes, I'm going to do this job. But no, when the white housewife says, and your daughters will come to work for me when they're grown. And no, my daughters are not going to do this kind of work. So it's this mixture of looking polite, looking nice, but at the same time standing your ground. And that was the gift that a lot of these black girls had learned. Okay, sit-ins were not a new thing. There were a bunch of sit-ins in the 1940s. But what happens is in 1960, there's a series of student sit-ins, mostly black college students, in Greensboro, North Carolina. And those sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina inspires this wave of student protests across 15 cities and 5 states. Within 18 months, 70,000 people had participated, mostly black youth, and 3,600 had been arrested. And these youth-organized demonstrations and sit-ins would continue across the decade. And this was college students, but it was also high school students, and even younger in some cases. And they were really putting themselves on the line. To give an example, the background to this picture was that a group of black girls, 30 of them, preteen and adolescents, had led a protest in Americus, Georgia. They were arrested and transported to the Leesburg stockade without anybody notifying their parents of where they were. They were just gone, as far as their parents knew. The Leesburg stockade had 1 broken toilet and 1 broken shower. Of course, no air conditioning, and this was in the summer, so the heat was at its sweltering worst. The girls were stuck there without toiletries, inadequate food, mosquitoes, roaches, ticks. They had to relieve themselves in the shower and tear strips off of their dresses in order to have something to use during their periods. They faced depression, dehydration, and bouts of diarrhea. And they basically held themselves together by praying, singing freedom songs, and holding each other. They were there for weeks before a SNCC photographer managed to take a picture of the girls' conditions and publicize it, and that basically led to enough public attention that the authorities had to agree to let the girls go. SNCC was founded in 1960. The Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee. New things developed, and you can sort of see this in this picture of this young woman here, SNCC volunteer. One of the things that they do, because in a lot of cases they're working with poor rural Black people who have almost nothing and don't have nice clothes, don't have the money to keep fancy haircuts or nails, polished nails, or any of those kinds of things. And so the SNCC volunteers began to basically give up respectability politics and try to dress like the people they were trying to help. And that's what she's doing here. SNCC went to the hard places like Mississippi and the rural areas where white racism and segregation were so deeply entrenched, along with poverty. And they tried to get people to organize to register to vote, but that was really hard to do, and you were constantly under threat. The homes where SNCC volunteers stayed would often be shot at. You would drive, SNCC volunteers would drive from one place to another. It might be followed by the police. The police might stop you. They might arrest you. Anything could happen. And you were constantly at risk. And women were an important part of the organization, and they faced the same kind of violence and hardship as the men did. Leadership was complicated. There were some Black women who became leaders in SNCC, but it just didn't occur to people to give Black women those kinds of positions. Gwendolyn Zoharah Simmons, who had worked in Mississippi as a member of SNCC, explained that she had been a project director. She often had to struggle around issues related to a woman being a project director. We had to fight for the resources, We had to fight to get a good car because the guys would get first dibs on everything. And that wasn't fair. It was a struggle to be taken seriously by the leadership as well as by your male colleagues. And she added, one of the things we often don't talk about, there was sexual harassment that often happened toward the women. And so that was one of the things, I took a stand on. There is not going to be sexual harassment of any of the women on this project or any of the women in this community, and you will be put out if you do it. It was also complicated for Black women because on the one hand, they want to support Black men. On the other hand, they want to use their own talents. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964, what this was a local decision that because the Democratic primary was pretty much all white in Mississippi, and so they were sending their own representatives to National Convention. And the SNCC activists and local activists argue, this isn't fair. These delegates do not represent us. So they decided to hold their own primary elections and vote for their own delegates to send to the convention. And they called themselves the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And I'm bringing this up because you have a striking amount of female participation and leadership in these organizations. And so one example of that is Fannie Lou Hamer, who lived on a sharecropping farm. Her husband was a sharecropper and she did accounts for the landowner. She was in her 40s and she heard the SNCC people talking and was inspired by them and tries to register to vote. And then she goes back to her home and the landowner basically says, "You stop that or I'm throwing you off the land." And Hamer describes herself as thinking, "I made up my mind, I was grown, and I was tired." As she continued her work for the campaign, she was beaten, arrested, jailed with fellow organizers. And Hamer was a powerful leader. She's the one who ends up speaking out for the delegation at the National Convention. Unita Blackwell's another black woman who plays an important leadership role. What happens at the convention is they do not seat the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party delegates, instead seating the Mississippi state delegates, the white delegates instead. And for a lot of people in the movement, this is sort of a turning point because it seems to them that the system is just not going to work with them. But Fannie Lou Hamer is going to continue to be a leader for the rest of her life. She dies, unfortunately, young. And Unita Blackwell is going to go on to be the first female black mayor in Mississippi and is going to serve from the 1970s to 2001. So there we have women who are actually taking the center stage leadership role in addition to the backstage work. Black nationalism and black power. This is complicated. By the late 60s, they're moving away from nonviolent protest, which frankly, not everybody had ever agreed with to start with. There had been people all along who advocated for violent protest, or at least meeting violence with violence. The violence that members of SNCC had seen, activists had been faced with, had really turned a lot of them against nonviolence. Increasingly, they turned to black power and black nationalism as embodied by the Black Panther movement, which is founded in 1966. This part of the movement is really complicated for black women because many black nationalists embrace an idea that comes from sociologists, black sociologists, but also is embraced by white thinkers and was published in a report by the federal government called the Moynihan Report, that the problem with black society is that black women emasculate black men and prevent them from taking their natural role as leaders of the home and the community. Therefore, black women need to step back, take a secondary position, not try to be leaders, allow black men to take the leadership. And not everybody, but a lot of black nationalists agreed with this, including some black women, believe this was the right time for that. At the same time as this, you've got the reality that 60% of the Black Panther Party is female. And that's a lot of women who are dedicated and activists and volunteers and need to do things. They play a really important role in what happens, and some of them become outright leaders as well, like Elaine Brown. But there's always this balancing act. And we'll talk more about this issue when we talk about black feminism next week. So what are the conclusions here? First of all, Black women were the foundations of the movement. If you look at the civil rights movement and look at the activists over 30, so not the really young people, but over 30, Black women were more than 3 to 4 times more likely to participate in the civil rights movement after 30 than Black men. So they're really a foundation, a critical part of moving that movement forward. Black women take leadership roles and organizing roles. In some cases, they're doing that leadership and organizing behind the scenes, taking second place to charismatic male leaders. And then there's some women who come out and take center stage, like Fannie Lou Hamer. I'd also like to point out the important role of girls as activists as well. And these are the sources, all of which are very good books, if you're interested.